In the year 1470, high within the mountains of Thessaly, a solitary bell tolls for the very last time, its echo fading across a valley that would never hear its call again. Within the hallowed walls of St. Catherine's convent, 23 women are on their knees in prayer, their voices a single, unified whisper, reciting words that have begun their days for countless years. Yet, on this particular morning, those sacred words feel foreign on their tongues, tasting of ash, of a final, sorrowful goodbye. Beyond the cold stone, the horizon isn't painted by the dawn, but bleeds a terrifying crimson. This red hue comes not from the sunrise, but from the countless banners of an empire renowned for devouring kingdoms whole. The Ottoman army does not simply march, it surges forward like a relentless river of steel and fire, meticulously erasing every trace of existence from its path. Sister Elaine, the abbess, grips a silver crucifix, passed down through 3 generations. Her hands may tremble, but it is not from fear. She, like all the others, understands what is coming. What they cannot possibly know, what no soul could ever fathom, is that a swift death would have been a profound mercy compared to what awaited them. The events that followed are not found in the history books you were given in school. This is a chapter of dark history that was deliberately buried, systematically erased, and shrouded in centuries of enforced silence until this very moment. What the Ottomans perpetrated against these women was not mere conquest. It was a far more sinister and calculated act, a truth that historians are only now daring to piece together. The real question is not whether you can stomach the truth, but whether you are prepared to reclaim a memory that was stolen. If you have ever questioned why certain stories are lost to time, while others are endlessly repeated, then you have found your way to the right place. Here, we unearth the archives the world chose to forget. Forgotten missionary letters, classified Ottoman state records, and harrowing testimonies locked away deep within Vatican vaults. Every single view, every like, and every subscription empowers us to rescue one more voice from the suffocating darkness of the past. Now, let us return to that doomed convent, because the bell has fallen silent and the heavy doors are beginning to splinter. To truly grasp the fate of these nuns, you must first understand the monolithic machine that was built to consume them. 17 years prior, in the year 1453, the jewel of Christendom, Constantinople, had finally fallen. A city that had endured for over 1,000 years was obliterated in just 53 days of relentless cannon fire and bloodshed. The Hagia Sophia, once the most magnificent cathedral in the known world, was stripped bare of its sacred crosses within mere hours of the city's fall. Its priceless mosaics were hastily covered in plaster, its ancient bells melted into scrap within a single week. From the very domes that had resonated with Christian hymns for 900 years, the Islamic call to prayer now echoed. Sultan Mehmed II, standing in the nave of that hallowed church, declared it a mosque, not from a need for another place of worship, but from an understanding that eludes most conquerors. He knew you don't truly defeat a people by ending their lives. You defeat them by erasing their very identity. The Ottomans were not merely conquering land, they were conquering memory itself. As Mehmed gazed west upon the fractured remnants of the Byzantine world, he saw not just defeated territories, but wounds that stubbornly refused to heal. Every church bell that dared to ring, every monastery that defiantly stood, every single cross that cast its shadow upon his conquered soil was a declaration, an act of silent defiance. It was living proof that the old world refused to perish, and every nun who continued to pray in Latin served as a potent, living symbol that faith could indeed outlast armies. This led the Sultan to a chilling decision. If they would not convert, they would simply be made to disappear. But not through a public massacre. A massacre forges martyrs, and martyrs ignite the flames of resistance. Songs are composed in their honor, epic stories are told. In death, they achieve immortality. No, the Ottomans had perfected a far more subtle and insidious method, a chilling tactic from the annals of dark history that left behind no songs, no stories, and ultimately, no memory. A complete and total erasure. By the year 1470, this terrifying strategy had been ruthlessly tested and refined across the empire, from the Greek monasteries in Morea to the Serbian convents in the Balkans and the ancient Armenian churches in Anatolia. They did not simply burn them all to the ground. Some were forcibly converted, others were left to crumble into ruin, but the insidious pattern remained identical. First, the offer was made. Then, came the profound, unending silence. And so we find the convent of St. Catherine, perched precariously on a Thessalian hillside, tragically distant from any friendly garrison or potential ally, was about to become another test case, another forgotten footnote in an empire's dark history. But these women were unaware they were destined to be footnotes. You must understand, these were not warriors. Their only weapons were their rosary beads, and their sole armor was their unwavering faith. The majority had never even seen a soldier, never clutched a blade, nor ever imagined they would need to. Sister Eleni had served as abbess for 12 years. Before that, she attended to the sick in a village that no longer existed, a place swallowed by the plague in 1448. She hadn't sought refuge in the convent to escape the world, but rather to find some meaning within its chaos. Sister Magdalena was a mere 19 years old. She had taken her vows only 2 years prior. Her hands still carried the rough calluses from her father's farm. She had joined the convent after her family was brutally eliminated in a raid. This sanctuary was the only place she had known peace since that day. Sister Theodora was 70. She had outlived 2 abbesses, an emperor, and more conflicts than she could possibly count. For her, the fear of death had vanished decades ago. But nothing could have prepared any of them for this. If this chilling moment from our dark history doesn't stir something within you, you might be overlooking the very lesson our ancestors perished to teach us, that in the shadow of immense power, the most defiant act is to refuse to forget who you are. Now, let us witness the inevitable collision of unwavering faith and an unstoppable empire. The first cannonball struck just after dawn. It didn't hit the chapel. It was aimed at the bell tower. The sound was nothing short of apocalyptic. Stone exploded into the sky as iron shrieked against iron in a symphony of destruction. The ancient bell, which had marked every sunrise for 140 years, was obliterated in mid-swing, its fragments raining down upon the very courtyard where the sisters cultivated their healing herbs. The same gentle hands that had nurtured those plants were now pressed against their ears, trembling. Yet Sister Eleni did not scream. She rose to her feet, her crucifix held defiantly high, and her voice cut through the chaos, singing the Kyrie eleison, Lord, have mercy. One by one, the other sisters joined their voices to hers. 23 voices formed a fragile chorus against the deafening roar of an empire. But empires have no ears for songs. By midday, the gates had been breached. Ottoman soldiers flooded the courtyard, not with swords drawn, but carrying ledgers, quills, and pots of ink. They moved through the sacred halls like accountants, not conquerors, methodically counting, recording, and cataloguing everything. Because in the cold calculus of the Ottoman Empire, these women were not people, they were assets. A translator was then pushed forward, a Greek man who had once called these very hills home. His voice trembled as he unrolled a scroll, every syllable heavy with the weight of his own shame. By the decree of Sultan Mehmet II, all subjects within these conquered lands must submit to the authority of the Sublime Porte. Those who embrace the new faith will be granted protection. Those who refuse will suffer the consequences reserved for rebels. Sister Eleni stepped forward. Her expression was placid, almost serene. She addressed not the soldiers, but the translator, speaking in Greek with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Inform your Sultan that our lives have already been pledged to a higher king. We have nothing left to surrender. The officer in charge, a man named Hassan Pasha, a name documented in Ottoman military records from the 1470 Thessalian campaign, did not react with fury. His response was far more chilling, a smile, for he understood a truth the nuns had yet to grasp. The Ottomans had perfected a cruel science of breaking the human spirit, a cornerstone of their dark history. They knew how to do it without ever laying a hand on them. That evening, the women were imprisoned within their own chapel, deprived of food and water, left with only darkness and the tormenting sounds of soldiers outside laughing, feasting, living as they waited to see which of them would be the first to break. 2 of the younger sisters, who had come from Corinth, collapsed into weeping in a corner, their desperate sobs echoing against the cold stone. But then, Sister Magdalena, herself, barely 20 years old, began to whisper a psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Her voice grew stronger with the next verse. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, she continued, and as her words filled the darkness, the sounds of weeping slowly faded into silence. This was the precise moment the Ottomans made their critical miscalculation. for these women had dedicated their entire lives to enduring hardship through fasting, frigid vigils, and profound suffering. They were accustomed to prolonged hours of silence and total submission to a power far greater than themselves. What the soldiers perceived as torture was, to the nuns, merely their daily spiritual discipline. Yet, Hasan Pasha remained patient, a veteran of such defiance, having witnessed it before in Moria, Wallachia, and amidst the haunting ruins of Serbian monasteries, all chapters in the empire's grim and dark history. He had seen monks who believed their faith alone would be their salvation, prompting him to write in a letter to the Sultan, a document still held in the Topkapi Palace archives, that faith is like a candle, it burns most brilliantly just before it is extinguished. He was now poised to put that very theory to the test, and on the second day, the heavy doors creaked open. A servant entered bearing bread and water, real sustenance, pure and clean, setting it down in absolute silence before departing as quietly as he came. The nuns could only stare at the offering, their throats parched and their stomachs aching with emptiness, while the younger sisters turned their desperate eyes toward Eleni. Sister Theodora, the most senior among them, was the first to speak, her voice raspy. They wish for us to accept it, to feel a sense of gratitude, to weaken our resolve. Eleni simply nodded in agreement. Then, we shall continue our fast. They refused to touch the food, and by the third day, their lips were cracked and bleeding, their hands trembled uncontrollably, and the youngest sisters struggled even to stand. Despite this, their spirit did not break. From the courtyard, Hasan Pasha observed them with his arms crossed, a mixture of impressment and frustration clouding his features, and perhaps, for a fleeting moment, something akin to respect flickered across his face. But respect was not a factor that altered strategy, and on the third day, the doors were opened once more. This time, it was not a servant who entered, but Hasan himself, who began to speak in the Turkish tongue. A translator trailed him like a shadow, echoing his words. "You are not considered criminals, nor are you enemies. You are merely misguided. The Sultan is a merciful ruler. He offers you new lives, new names, and his divine protection. All that is required is for you to speak the words." His offer was met with silence. Alternatively, you can accompany us to Constantinople. There, the Sultan himself will preside over your case. It is possible he will be moved by your conviction. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the tense air. But the journey is arduous, and the frail do not survive it. This was not a threat. It was a promise, a chilling echo from the empire's long and dark history. Sister Eleni glanced at her sisters. Some were barely conscious, others were deep in prayer with their eyes shut tightly, and a few simply stared at the floor, as if trying to draw strength from the cold stone beneath them. She turned her gaze back to Hasan and declared, "We will walk." A slow smile spread across his face. "Excellent. We shall depart at dawn." That night, the nuns huddled together in the suffocating darkness, no one uttering a single word. Then, Sister Magdalena began to hum a soft, haunting hymn they often sang at Vespers, and one by one, the others joined her melody. Outside, the soldiers heard the sound, and some of them paused in their duties. Some averted their gaze, and one of them, many years later, would recount to his grandson the story of the women who sang as they marched toward their demise. But that story, like so many others, would also be lost to time. For now, the hymn ascended through the cracks in the chapel walls, drifting out into the vast, silent night. It was at once a prayer, a plea, and a defiant declaration. We are still here. They began their march at dawn on the fourth day. 23 women, their hands bound tightly with coarse rope, began the long walk south towards the coast, with no carts and no horses to aid them. There was only the unforgiving ground beneath their feet, the choking dust, and a sun that offered no mercy. The road itself was designed to be the punishment. By the second day of the march, Sister Irene collapsed. She was 62 years old, and her knees had been failing her for years. She fought to stand, but her legs refused to bear her weight. The soldiers did not wait. Sister Magdalena and another nun, Sister Anna, immediately moved to lift her between them. They carried her this way for the next 3 miles. When the group finally halted for the night, Irene was unconscious, and by the following morning, she was gone. They buried her by the side of the road, using only their bare hands, with no tools and no ceremony, just handfuls of dirt and whispered prayers. The soldiers watched, not interfering. Hasan Pasha simply made an entry in his ledger, a cold footnote in the Empire's dark history, 22 remaining on the fourth day. And then, it happens again. Sister Callista, who had been silent since the horrors of the siege, simply stops walking. She sits down, right there, in the middle of the road, closes her eyes, and refuses to rise again. They are forced to leave her there. By the time they finally reach the port of Volos, a full 7 days later, only 18 souls remain. But something had changed on that road, a grim turn in this dark history that the Ottomans had not foreseen. The nuns' weeping had ended, their pleas had fallen silent. They walked in a profound quiet, but it was not the quiet of defeat. It was the chilling silence of women who had already made their choice. Sister Eleni had been at the forefront of the line, leading them even with her hands bound. But on the morning of that seventh day, Hassan Pasha summons her. She is taken to his tent, alone. What transpired next is conspicuously absent from Ottoman records, but it is described in a letter from a Venetian merchant who witnessed the aftermath, a letter discovered in 2003 within the archives of Dubrovnik. He writes, "I saw them return her at dawn. She could not stand. Her eyes. May God forgive me. Her eyes were open, but the person within them was gone. They dressed her in fine silk and paraded her through the camp as a convert. But when I drew close, I could hear her lips moving. She was still reciting prayers in Latin, a silent act of defiance. She had not broken. They had simply taken her body, leaving her soul to wander." This reveals a chilling Ottoman strategy, a piece of dark history that official accounts rarely mention. They did not want martyrs. Martyrs inspire resistance. Songs are written for them. Stories are told. The dead are elevated to sainthood. They wanted ghosts, women who would walk, talk, eat, and breathe, but would never be whole again, serving as living proof that rebellion was futile, as breathing warnings to anyone who believed faith could withstand an empire. Sister Eleni walked with them the rest of the way to the coast, but she never spoke another word, never met another person's gaze. She was physically present, but her spirit was gone. The younger sisters wept at the sight of her. The older ones just prayed with greater fervor. At the port of Volos, they were forced onto a galley, a massive warship with rows of benches and chains bolted directly to the wood. This was no passenger ship. This was a vessel engineered for absolute control, for slaves, prisoners, and cargo. The nuns were chained to the benches, their wrists locked into cold iron rings. A ship's manifest, unearthed in 1987 in Istanbul's Topkapi Palace Museum, lists them not by name, but as a number: religious captives, female, quantity 18, destination, the imperial household, purpose, domestic service, and conversion. That word service carries an immense and sinister weight. The voyage lasted a grueling 12 days. The sea was not merciful. Storms lashed the deck, while salt spray stung their cracked lips. The ship heaved and rolled, and the women, many of whom had never seen the ocean, vomited until there was nothing left inside them. At night, the youngest sister, Magdalena, would whisper psalms beneath her breath. Her voice was a faint thread of sound, nearly lost in the roar of the waves. But the other prisoners, Greeks, Serbs, Italians, men and women chained beside them, would turn their heads to listen. For a brief moment, the sea itself seemed to fall silent. When the ship finally sailed into the Bosphorus, the sisters saw the skyline of Constantinople rise before them, a panorama of domes, minarets, and walls that seemed to stretch into eternity. The city gleamed in the dawn light like the edge of a blade. For centuries, it had been called the city of the world's desire. Now, it was to be their cage. From the docks, they were marched through narrow streets crowded with merchants, soldiers, and slaves. People stopped in the streets to stare. Christian nuns among the captives were a rarity, a stark footnote in the empire's dark history of conquest. This was an unusual sight. They were led past the ancient walls, through the imperial district, past lavish gardens where fountains sang and peacocks screamed, and then, in the vast shadow of the Hagia Sophia, the great church that was now a mosque, they were forced to stop, compelled to kneel, as the call to prayer echoed from its minarets. One of the sisters murmurs, "We are home," but the words are hollow, for this place is no longer theirs. They are escorted to the palace, yet their path bypasses the grand halls and the courtyards bustling with ambassadors and scheming viziers. Instead, they are led beneath, down stone steps that coil into an oppressive darkness, through tunnels reeking of dampness and decay, towards a section of the palace that exists outside of any official record. If you are still with me, it's because some part of you understands that this piece of dark history must be brought to light. Subscribe to Crimson Historians, not for our sake, but for theirs, for the voices that were systematically swallowed by silence. Now, let us follow them into the shadows, deep beneath the foundations of Topkapi Palace. Here, a labyrinth of tunnels exists that no tourist will ever see. Forgotten storage rooms, cramped servant quarters, and lost corridors that snake through the bedrock like dark veins. And in the most remote corner, sealed away for centuries, lies a chamber with no designated purpose. Then, in 2011, during extensive restoration work, a team of archaeologists breached a false wall. The discovery they made inside brought their work to a standstill. Etched faintly into the stone were crosses, dozens upon dozens of them, small and crudely made, seemingly carved with fingernails or sharp shards of pottery. And just beneath these symbols of faith were 4 words etched in Latin: Lux in tenebri, lucet, the light shines in the darkness. This was their secret chapel. For months, perhaps even for years, these women existed in the palace's underbelly, toiling as invisible servants by day, scrubbing floors and washing linens, tending to fires in opulent rooms they were forbidden to enter. But as night fell and the palace slept, they would gather in this forgotten chamber to pray. They had no priest, no formal altar, not even a Bible, only their collective memory. They recited psalms they knew by heart, piecing together half-forgotten verses into prayers that became their lifeline. They sang hymns in whispers so faint they barely disturbed the air. Their communion was taken with bread purloined from the kitchens and water drawn from the palace wells, as they carved their faith into the cold stone, one scratch at a time, believing it would never be seen by human eyes. Sister Magdalena was one of them, the same young woman who had whispered psalms on the ship, who had carried Sister Irani on the long road, the one who refused to look away when they returned. Sister Eleni shrouded in silk. She had become their voice in the darkness. Archaeologists even found her personal mark, a small bird, scratched into a corner of the wall. Beside it were 23 lines, one for each sister, but chillingly, only 11 of those lines were finished. The remaining lines simply trailed off into nothingness. They fashioned candle holders from broken pottery and used a scrap of linen as an altar cloth. From a sliver of a shattered mirror, they crafted a crude, reflective cross. Here, in this hidden chapel, they would assemble each night after the palace grew silent. There were no booming hymns, no formal sermons, only hushed whispers. Each woman would kneel and offer a memory, the vision of a childhood home, the sound of a distant church bell, the simple warmth of bread baked before dawn. These memories transformed into their new psalms, small, precious offerings to a God they believed still listened in the dark. A tantalizing clue comes from a Venetian prisoner held for ransom in the palace in 1478, who wrote of eerie voices echoing from beneath the harem, of women singing in Latin to a god foreign to the empire. For centuries, historians brushed this off as mere superstition, a ghost story until the chapel was discovered. But this is where the story takes a heartbreaking turn. The carved crosses stop abruptly, halfway across the wall. The scratches grow erratic, desperate. The lines gouged into the stone deepen, as if carved with frantic force and a terrible urgency. And then, there is nothing. This is where the official account meets the empire's dark history. Records from 1482 mention a purification of the palace staff under the new sultan. Anyone deemed unproductive or resistant was to be removed. There are no further details, no names listed, and no record of burial sites. All that remains is a single line in an official ledger, written in precise, neat Ottoman script. The word reads, "disposed." And just like that, the nuns of St. Catherine were erased from history. 18 women who had endured a 7-day walk through hell, who had crossed the sea bound in chains, who had etched their prayers into stone in the pitch-black dark, were simply gone. But their chapel, their testament, remained. A French diplomat, writing in 1712, recorded a persistent rumor among the elderly palace servants. They claimed that on certain nights, if one stood in the lower halls, the air would turn unnaturally cold, and if you listened with absolute stillness, hearing the faint echoes of women singing in Latin, he brushed it off as mere superstition, the fanciful tales of his uneducated servants. But the walls themselves don't lie. In 2011, As archaeologists examined the chapel more closely, they uncovered something else, a chilling piece of dark history. They found traces of wax, not from the standard Ottoman candles, but from an entirely different, much older source, one infused with herbs. This was the type of candle meticulously crafted by nuns in their convents, a discovery which meant their solemn vigil had endured far longer than anyone had ever imagined. For months, perhaps even for years, they were down there, carving their crosses, whispering their prayers, and defiantly refusing to be erased from existence. The final marking found on the wall was Sister Magdalena's bird. Next to it, etched so faintly it was nearly invisible, were two simple words in Greek: "We endure." Yet the truth is, their legacy was more than endurance. They left behind an indelible mark that no empire could ever truly erase. A chamber filled with crosses, a prayer etched into stone, irrefutable proof that faith could triumph where stone walls and iron chains had failed. The Ottoman Empire itself would last until 1922, 600 years of conquest and immense power. Yet in the end, it was those simple scratches on a wall that outlasted it all. Not the Sultan's grand decrees, nor Hassan Pasha's meticulous ledgers, not even the fine silk they used to dress Sister Elaine. All that remained were 4 Latin words, carved by women the world had forgotten. Lux in tenebris lucet, the light shines in the darkness. Now, why is this story so important? Because ultimately, it isn't just about religion. It's not even solely about the Ottomans. It's a stark reminder of what absolute power does when it attempts to erase a people, and the incredible things that happen when those people refuse to vanish. This is a recurring theme in the dark history of empires. For 600 years, the Ottoman Empire reigned. They conquered 3 continents, redrew the maps of the world, and reshaped languages and entire cultures. They transformed the greatest cathedral in all of Christendom into a mosque, and commanded a territory that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the vast deserts of Arabia. And yet, they could not erase 18 women who simply scratched their prayers into stone. Just consider that. A colossal empire with massive armies, cannons, and limitless resources, driven by the will to remake the world, pitted against women armed with nothing more than their fingernails and their faith. And in a way, the women won not by the standards that empires use to measure victory. They never reclaimed their convent. They didn't convert their captors or live to see a day of freedom, but they left a mark. We're often told that history is written by the victors, but memory that is written by the survivors. And sometimes, survival looks like a simple cross, carved in the pitch black, where no one was ever meant to see it. This is the essence of their dark history. It looks like a prayer whispered in a language the conquerors sought to silence, a bird scratched into stone to commemorate the sisters who were lost. And centuries later, against all odds, we found it. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once wrote that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. These women were forced to live their lives forward, straight into darkness. They walked for 7 days, knowing they might not survive the journey. They crossed the sea bound in chains, fully aware of what awaited them on the other side. They descended into the tunnels beneath a grand palace, knowing it was possible they would never see the light of day again. Despite it all, they carved their prayers, trusting that someone, someday, would look back in time and find their message. In 2011, that's exactly what happened. As an archaeologist stood in that hidden chapel, staring in awe at those crosses, one of them posed a question that still haunts me. How long did they keep this vigil? The traces of wax suggest a period of years, and the sheer depth of some of the carvings indicates a desperate, repeated effort. This means these women gathered, night after night, year after year, in complete darkness, refusing to abandon their faith, even as their sisters began to disappear. Even when the number of scratches on the wall ceased to grow, even when all hope should have logically died, they kept carving. That isn't just faith, that is defiance in its purest, most potent form. The Ottoman Empire is gone now, dissolved in 1922. Its powerful sultans are nothing but dust. Its once feared armies are a distant memory. The palace itself still stands, but it's now a museum. Tourists stroll through its halls, taking pictures, completely unaware of the profound, dark history that lies just beneath their feet. And yet, those crosses remain. And that Latin phrase, barely visible after 500 years, still speaks its truth. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. This powerful phrase comes from the Gospel of John, a passage describing a light that can never be put out, a testament to a truth that endures even when all else is stripped away. Sister Magdalena etched these words with the certain knowledge she would never escape that palace, knowing her identity would be lost to time, knowing the world would forget her completely, but she carved them as a final act of defiance, because she understood a fundamental truth that empires always miss. You can conquer nations, you can manipulate the official narrative, and you can bury the dead in unmarked graves, a recurring chapter in our dark history. But you can never destroy what people carry in their hearts, and you can never silence a message carved into everlasting stone. You've just confronted one of history's most profound and somber lessons. If stories like this, drawn from the depths of our shared dark history, remind you of humanity's fragility and how easily truth can be buried, then subscribe to Crimson Historians and help keep the past from fading. For some, voices must be heard, especially those that were brutally silenced centuries ago. The nuns of St. Catherine were intended to be erased from existence. That was the ultimate objective: break them, erase them, and reduce them to forgotten ghosts, reluctant converts, or mere notations in Ottoman ledgers. But they refused to disappear. Their spirit endures in those crosses, in that powerful Latin phrase, in the chapel that archaeologists would unearth 500 years later. And now, they are here with you, because you listened and because you remembered, because you refused to let silence be their final legacy. Lux in tenebris lucet, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.